This next set of PowerPoint slides and this next video looks in more detail at the practical advantages and disadvantages to letting states versus the federal government control policy in a particular area. So when we think about this again, we have to remember that whatever power we give states applies to all states equally. So there'll be some states that are better equipped financially in terms of expertise or oversight to do a good job with policymaking, and some states won't do as good a job. But whatever power we give states or we think states should have is going to apply equally to all states. And by the same token, power shifts at the national level as well. When our preferred party's in power, we may want that level of government to have more control because we like the policies it's pursuing. But that party won't always be in power. So the policies pursued by the Obama administration on the environment or immigration, for example, are vastly different than the policies pursued by the Trump administration. So whatever authority we think that level of government should have in a particular area needs to transcend our preferred party. So with that in mind, I also want to point you to one of the exercises in the book. It's exercise 3.3, and it asks you to consider actual court cases and where you would rule in favor of the states or the federal government. And it really highlights the complexity of these issues and how complicated and how difficult it can be to find the right balance. Okay. The PowerPoint slides apply these practical reasons to the area of the environment. So we'll touch on that a little bit in this video, but we're going to look more broadly at other policies as well, because the PowerPoints are, I think, fairly clear how this would apply to environmental policy. So when people think about why states should have control, one of the first things they think about is the incredible diversity at the state level, and that letting states control policy allows them to respond to that diversity and to tailor policy to what they want or what they think they need. So states vary in size and level of urbanization. Some states are very urbanized, like New York or California. Others are much more rural, like South Dakota or Montana or Wyoming. Some are demographically very diverse, like Texas or Florida or New York or California, and some are much more homogeneous, like Idaho or Vermont. States are very different economically, and they're very different politically. The people of different states, although every state is a mix of liberals and conservatives and progressives, some states trend much more conservatively and some trend much more progressively or liberally. And so if we think of an issue area where it might be controversial for us in California, for example, evolution as part of a science curriculum. In public schools in California, you learn about evolution, and most Californians support that. There are areas of the country where the majority of people in a given state or school district oppose the teaching of evolution, or oppose it unless it's balanced against something like intelligent design that has kind of religious underpinnings and is not supported by the scientific community. So we're faced with this dilemma of whether we force those states to teach their children in a way that the majority of people in the states disagree with, or whether we let them tailor policy in a way that might seem strange to us. Or some states, when they teach sex ed, teach abstinence-only sex education to their students. Texas, for example. In California, this is not the way it's done. It's a much more comprehensive, factually based sex education. So do we allow states to teach something like that in the way that most people in that state want? Or do we impose some kind of blanket policy for all states, even though some people are really going to disagree with that, and even a majority of people in some states will disagree with that? So whether we're talking about economic policy, environmental policy, immigration policy, social policy, the diversity of states and allowing states to have that power at some level makes sense, okay? On the flip side, there is an argument to be made for national standards and for letting the national government control policy in that area so that laws in a given state don't become too varied and that states don't go so far afield from some kind of basic standard that they mismanage policy in a fundamental way. So if you think about education policy, again, is there an argument on the flip side to be made that regardless of what people might feel, we should do evidence-based policymaking? So for example, if abstinence-only sex ed does not demonstrate effectiveness in preventing teenage pregnancy or giving young people the information they need to make good choices about their sexuality, should we still let states do it if that's what most people want? Or should we impose something that has more evidence behind it? Should we force states to have some minimum standards environmentally? And in fact, the federal government does do that. But should they be stricter, or how much leeway should states have? What rights are so fundamental, or what issues are so important that we can't allow states so much leeway in policy? Maybe for some of us, that's reproductive rights, or environmental policy, or the death penalty. So there are arguments to be made, whether it's education or welfare or immigration, that there's something to be said, if we are one country, for having one standard. And again, we'll talk in just a few minutes about the fact that it is impossible to keep whatever policy we're dealing with contained within the borders of a state. So states might have a particular opinion, but one way or another, the consequences of policy will move beyond that state's border. The second major reason that people will advocate for state control is because state level officials are closer to people. It's much easier in California to go to Sacramento and talk to your assembly person, or go to their local office that might be in your neighborhood, than to go all the way to Washington, D.C. and try to find your senator or your House representative there. It's even easier to reach the governor than it is to reach the President of the United States. And so by allowing people more access to the elected officials who design policy, the idea is that regular people will have more influence over policy, and that would strengthen democracy. It would strengthen that relationship between voters and their representatives, and it would make representatives more responsive to people. We do see in the case of environmental policy, for example, that states with greener policy, like Washington State or California, have populations of voters who, by and large, are more supportive of those same policies. At the national level, we see something very different, at least under the current administration. That environmental policy does not reflect what most voters in California want, or most voters in, for example, Washington State. So by allowing policy to be made more locally, it's easier for us to access those officials. The flip side of that is that local politics and state level politics is less visible. The media doesn't pay as much attention to it, and we don't pay as much attention to it as a result. So if the state is not doing a good job with a particular policy, if it's mismanaging it, if there's corruption, we are less likely to find that out. So the low visibility of state officials can increase the potential for corruption, for mismanagement, for just badly designed and badly implemented policies. And by having it done at the national level, we are more likely to, as citizens, as voters, as people living in the United States, have some oversight about what's going on and be more aware of what the government's doing. Okay, next video, we'll talk about the third major issue.